Hello there, my name's Annette with Sunbeam Fabric Art. Welcome to my channel. In my last video, I showed you how to make flying geese 3 ways. That's because I wanted to make some flying geese units with the quilt kit that I got for $6 at a garage sale. So today's project is the third quilt from a $6 quilt kit, all for charity. So come along with me today and I will show you what I did. Here's a look at that quilt kit as it was when I opened it. Now here's a look at what I have left after finishing 2 quilts. I have a few 10-inch squares left, not many, and lots of strips. I counted up the lights and the darks of my 10-inch squares that I had left. From testing out the 4-of-a-kind flying geese method, I'm going to be using 1 10-inch square light and 1 10-inch square dark cut into 5-inch squares. So I'll get 4 geese from each light and dark combo. I'll have 2 units of those geese put together, and they will make an 8-inch by 8-inch block. I'll be able to make 5 columns with 8 geese blocks, and then I'm still thinking about what I'm going to do to make the quilt a little bit wider. The first decision I had to make was what color the inside of the goose was going to be. So I decided I was going to use the dark fabric for the inside of the goose and the lighter fabric for the wings of the goose. The first thing I needed to do was cut off 1 inch from a side of these 10-inch squares and from the top, so I would have a 9-inch square. And of course, all those 1-inch strips, they are going into that pile of strips, and those are going to be used up on the next quilt. Once I had the 10-inch squares of the dark trimmed to 9 inches, I cut the light squares into 5-inch squares. Now in one of the other quilts, I had this kind of medium shade. It wasn't light, wasn't dark, just kind of right in the middle. And it was easy for me to decide to use the back side of this particular fabric to get a lighter look. Looking at those side by side, you can really see how the contrast is much better by using the reverse side of this fabric. So the right side is now the wrong side, and the wrong side is the right side. So I'm putting these 2 fabrics together, right sides together, which means the light side against the dark side. I'm placing the 2 5-inch squares overlapping in opposite corners of my 9-inch square. I'll place pins in the 5-inch squares to hold them in place. With everything pinned into place, I'm ready to draw my first line. I'm going to draw a diagonal line straight across these 5-inch squares. First I used my white chalk pencil, but that didn't show up too well, so I decided to just use a regular ink pen to draw my lines on this medium shade fabric. The next step is to stitch a 1/4 inch away from this line on both sides. When I have units like this with pins and things need to be staying in place, I don't like to chain piece. So what you see me doing here is one unit at a time. I'm stitching down one side, then the other side, then moving on to the next square. The next step is to cut these units apart on the line that I drew. And that gives me 2 little units with flaps. Once those units were all cut apart, I pressed the flaps open. And now we are ready for the next step to make our flying geese units. I'm going to be taking one 5-inch square for each of these little heart-shaped units. I'm going to be placing that diagonally, the light side together with the dark side, placing those two sides together. I'll go ahead and place my pins. And now I'm taking a ruler and a pen. I'm going to draw a diagonal line on this little square I'm adding. I'm going from the middle of where that heart shape comes together to the opposite corner, drawing a little line there. Since I don't have to line up this 5-inch square with any other square, I'm going to go ahead and go through and draw all my lines first, and then I'll be pinning them to those heart shapes. The next step will be to take these units to the sewing machine, and I'm going to stitch down one side of the line 1/4 inch away and then back up the other side about 1/4 inch away from that line. Since these units were smaller, I thought I'd go ahead and try to chain piece. One modification I made about halfway through is once I stitched that seam on one side, I removed both pins. And once again, we're going to go through all the units and cut them apart on the line that I drew. Once all those units were cut apart, I pressed that flap open. The next step is to trim these flying geese units. Based on the tests I did in my previous video, I know what I'm going to do here. I'm lining up my diagonal line on the ruler with that top diagonal seam. I'm getting the 4-inch line on my ruler, the horizontal line, going right to the point, and then I want to make sure I have a 1/4 inch overhang seam allowance on that left-hand side there. Once the right-hand side and the top are trimmed, I can flip the unit around, and I'm lining up at 4¼ inches on the left and 8 inches on the bottom. And now you can see I've got that 1/4 inch seam allowance on the top, so I should be able to retain most of my points. Now it's time to put 2 of these units together, and with the 8½ inches width, 4¼ plus 4¼ when I fold these over and stitch them together, it'll finish to an 8-inch block, and in a quilt that would be 7½ inches finished. And I'm stitching those so I can see the point as it goes under the needle. Kind of keep an eye on it. Once I had my 40 blocks together, I started putting blocks together in columns of 8 each. And since I had 40 blocks, I had 5 columns with 8 blocks in each column. And I have all the geese in each column going the same way. Well, I wanted to make my quilt a little bit wider. I thought the 5 columns would be a little too skinny. At 7½ times 5, that's about 30 or 40 inches wide. So I went through my stash to try and find some kind of color that I could use in a strip to separate my 5 columns. I really like several of these choices, especially that turquoise. But what I ended up going with was this burgundy fabric from my stash. I picked this up somewhere at a thrift store or an estate sale. It is vintage fabric too, and I like that the light pink in it matches the colors of the quilt kit. I took the fabric and cut it into 2½ inch strips, and any leftovers are going to go into that strip pile that I have already that you saw at the beginning, and that's going to be going into the next quilt. Next up, I joined all these 2½ inch strips together with a diagonal seam. I trimmed off those extra triangles and pressed those seams nice and flat. Then I sewed these strips of the burgundy fabric to the columns of my flying geese. I put all the columns together and I put them in opposite directions. Then I went around the outside of the quilt with that 2.5-inch burgundy fabric. I trimmed away any excess from the corners of the quilt. Next up, I did go ahead and take the time with all these units I put together to press this quilt nice and flat. Well, the first time I ever made a quilt like this was braids. I did a braided quilt with columns, and they were going opposite ways, and it freaked me out the first time I looked at it. It creates this optical illusion where it looks like the geese are skinnier at one side than the opposite side. That's just something that happens. The first time it happened to me, I actually went through and measured the columns. I'm like, what did I do? I thought I messed up my quilt. Well, thanks so much for sticking around with me to the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I do hope to see you back again real soon.